Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Imagine sitting down at a family dinner, your name already dragged through the mud, and suddenly, all eyes are on you as you pull out the ultimate evidence, a video that changes everything. The morning after my sister's wedding, I woke up to chaos. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Call after call, text after text. At first, I thought maybe something had gone wrong with the wedding cleanup or someone needed a ride home. But when I unlocked my phone, my stomach sank. Every single message had one thing in common. They were accusing me of stealing. The wedding money, specifically the envelope that held the cash gifts from family and friends, had gone missing. And somehow, I was the prime suspect. My sister's first text was still at the top of my notifications, glaring at me like a flashing red light. How could you do this to me? I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it. Me? Steal the wedding money? It didn't even make sense. Why would I steal from my own sister? And on her wedding day, no less. My initial reaction was that this had to be some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe the envelope had just been misplaced. But as I scrolled through the messages, I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a full-blown accusation. By lunchtime, the whole family had been roped into it. My sister wasn't just telling people that the money was missing. She was telling them I was the thief. My parents called me, demanding to know what I had done. My aunt left a voice message that started with, "I can't believe you would stoop so low," and ended with her bursting into tears. Even my cousins were texting me things like, "Why would you ruin her big day like this?" It felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. No one gave me a chance to explain or even asked me if it was true. They'd already made up their minds. The consensus was simple. I was guilty. After all, as my dad put it during one of his shorter, angrier calls, why would your sister lie about something like this? The worst part? I couldn't even figure out why my sister thought I'd done it in the first place. She kept saying I was the last person near the gift table, but I barely remembered even going near it at all. The night had been a blur of dancing, drinks, and family photos. I hadn't noticed anything unusual, and I definitely hadn't touched any envelopes. I spent the rest of the day trying to defend myself, but it was like talking to a brick wall. No one wanted to hear my side of the story. My mom kept cutting me off every time I tried to explain, saying, "You're only making this worse for yourself." My dad told me to just admit it and apologize, like I could just confess to something I didn't do and make it all go away. By the end of the day, I was officially the black sheep of the family. My sister wasn't even responding to my messages anymore, and my parents were clearly too upset to hear me out. I couldn't believe how quickly everyone had turned on me. But as hurt and angry as I was, one thing kept bothering me. If I didn't take the money, and I knew I didn't, then who did? The days following the wedding were the loneliest I'd ever experienced. The worst part wasn't even the accusations anymore. It was the complete silence that followed. It was like I'd been erased from the family. My phone, which had been blowing up with accusations the day before, suddenly stopped ringing. No calls, no texts, no check-ins. My mom, who normally couldn't go a day without texting me at least a few times, barely responded to my messages. And when she did, her replies were cold, clipped, and distant. At first, I thought maybe my dad would be the voice of reason. He'd always been the calmer one, the mediator when things got tense. But when I called him, hoping he'd at least let me explain, his response shocked me. "I think we all just need some time to process this," he said, his voice heavy and disappointed. Process what? I thought. I hadn't done anything wrong. Even my cousin Lisa, who's been my best friend since we were kids, seemed to be keeping her distance. When I finally worked up the courage to call her, she hesitated before saying, "Look, I don't know what to believe right now. It's just a lot." That hurt more than anything. Lisa and I had been through everything together, breakups, family fights, even that time we got lost in the woods during a camping trip. I never thought she'd doubt me. What made it all even harder was the fact that I couldn't figure out why my sister thought I'd done this to her. Sure, we'd had our fair share of sibling arguments growing up, fights over clothes, whose turn it was to do the dishes, petty stuff like that. But this, accusing me of stealing the wedding money, it felt so out of left field. I replayed every moment of the wedding in my head, trying to pinpoint where it all went wrong. Did I say something that upset her? Did I accidentally do something that made her think I was guilty? The last time I remembered being near the gift table was when we were setting up before the ceremony. After that, I've been busy taking photos with family, dancing, and sneaking bites of cake when no one was looking. The more I thought about it, the more frustrated I became. No matter how much I racked my brain, I couldn't come up with a single reason why she'd target me like this. And the fact that no one, not my parents, not Lisa, not even my sister, wanted to give me the benefit of the doubt just made it worse. The silence from everyone wasn't just emotionally draining. It was suffocating. I found myself checking my phone constantly, hoping for even a single message from someone willing to hear me out. But the only notifications I got were junk emails and app updates. At one point, I decided to drive over to my parents' house, thinking maybe I could talk to them face to face. But when I pulled into the driveway, my mom met me at the door with a tired, strained look on her face. "This isn't a good time," she said, not even letting me inside. I tried to plead with her, telling her I just wanted to explain, but she shook her head. "I don't want to get in the middle of this," she said before closing the door. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, staring at the steering wheel and wondering how things had spiraled so far out of control. My own mother wouldn't even hear me out. The silence wasn't just coming from my family either. It felt like the world itself had turned against me. Social media became a minefield. I'd see posts from family members about the wedding, all with comments about how tragic it was that someone had to ruin such a beautiful day. Nobody named me directly, but the insinuation was clear. I started avoiding Facebook and Instagram altogether. Every time I opened them, I felt like I was walking into a room full of people whispering behind my back. Even work became unbearable. My coworkers noticed I was distracted, and when one of them asked if everything was okay, I almost broke down right there. The isolation gave me way too much time to think, and the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that there was more to the story. The whole thing didn't add up. My sister's accusation felt too sudden, too pointed, and too personal. I started wondering if there was something nobody else was seeing, or worse, something they didn't want to see. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a missing piece, something that would make all of this make sense. But if nobody else was going to look for it, then I'd have to do it myself. Nearly a week of silence and isolation had passed, and I realized I couldn't keep waiting for the truth to magically come out. The longer I stayed quiet, the more convinced my family seemed that I was guilty. I had to do something, anything, to clear my name. I started with what little I had, my own memory of the wedding. I wrote down everything I could remember from the moment I arrived at the venue to when I left. Every conversation, every interaction, every detail, no matter how small, went onto the page. But even as I pored over my notes, nothing stood out. It was all just fragments of a normal wedding day. That's when I realized I needed more than my memory. I needed evidence. I decided to start with photos. Weddings are like photo gold mines, with everyone snapping pictures and recording videos nonstop. I knew there had to be something out there that could prove my innocence, or at least point me in the right direction. I reached out to the photographer first, asking if I could see some of the shots from the reception. It was a long shot, but I thought maybe they'd accidentally captured something suspicious. The photographer, while polite, was hesitant to share anything before finishing the editing process. Still, I begged them to check if they had any clear images of the gift table. They promised to look and get back to me, but I could tell it wasn't their priority. Then I tried the wedding venue. I knew most places had security cameras these days, and I thought maybe they'd have footage from the night. When I called, the receptionist told me they did have cameras, but they usually erased the footage after 72 hours unless something specific was flagged. My heart sank. I was already too late. Just when I was starting to lose hope, I remembered something, my phone. I've been taking videos all night, mostly of the dance floor, the speeches, and the random family moments that make weddings memorable. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. I was just trying to capture some fun memories. But now, those videos felt like my last lifeline. I spent hours scrolling through my camera roll, watching every clip in painstaking detail. Most of them were exactly what I expected. Blurry shots of people dancing, my uncle doing his usual terrible dad moves, and a close-up of the cake that I had apparently found fascinating. Nothing stood out. Just as I was about to give up, I found it. It was a short video, maybe 15 seconds long, that I'd taken during the speeches. I'd been sitting at my table, filming my sister and her husband as they thanked everyone for coming. In the background, just behind them was the gift table. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. But when I slowed the video down and looked closer, my stomach dropped. Someone was standing near the gift table. They weren't just standing there, either. They were crouched down, partially obscured by the edge of the table. When they stood back up, they had something in their hands. I couldn't tell what it was. It could have been a piece of paper, an envelope, or even a napkin. But the movement was deliberate. I rewound the video and watched it again and again and again. The more I watched, the more certain I became. Whoever that was, they weren't supposed to be near the gift table at that moment. The figure wasn't immediately recognizable in the video. The lighting wasn't great, and they were facing away from the camera. But I could make out a few details. Shoulder-length hair, a dark dress, and the way they moved. almost like they were trying not to draw attention to themselves. My heart was pounding. This was something. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was the first clue I'd found since the accusations began. I knew I couldn't jump to conclusions without more evidence. I needed to figure out who this person was and what they were doing. But even as I tried to remain calm, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered a name: Sarah. Sarah was my sister's maid of honor and one of her closest friends. She'd been involved in every part of the wedding planning, from picking the color scheme to coordinating the seating chart. She was also someone I hadn't gotten along with for years. Something about Sarah's behavior at the wedding had stuck with me. She'd seemed jumpy, almost overly friendly whenever she talked to me, like she was trying to keep things light and casual. At the time, I thought she was just being polite. But now, looking back, it felt calculated. Could it really have been her in the video? I spent the rest of the night analyzing every second of the clip. I zoomed in, adjusted the brightness, and even tried some free editing apps to sharpen the image. The more I worked on it, the more convinced I became that Sarah was the figure near the gift table. But I needed more proof. If I went to my family with just this blurry video, they'd dismiss it immediately. I had to keep digging, but at least now I had a direction to focus on. For the first time since the accusations began, I felt a flicker of hope. If Sarah really had something to do with the missing money, then it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. I couldn't stop watching the video. Over and over, I replayed the 15-second clip, each time trying to convince myself that what I was seeing wasn't what it looked like. But no matter how much I tried to dismiss it as nothing more than a coincidence, I kept coming back to the same conclusion. It wasn't me near the gift table. It was Sarah. Her back was to the camera, so I couldn't see her face, but the details were unmistakable. The shoulder-length dark hair, the black lace dress, even the way she moved, it all screamed Sarah. She wasn't just standing there either. She was crouched down, rummaging through something on the table. When she stood back up, her hands were no longer empty. At first, I tried to reason it away. Maybe she was moving something, organizing the gifts, or even just tidying up. She was a maid of honor, after all, and it wouldn't be unusual for her to take on little tasks like that. But the more I thought about it, the more the pieces didn't fit. Sarah had been acting strange all night, though I hadn't thought much of it at the time. During the ceremony, she seemed distracted, constantly glancing around the room. At the reception, she avoided eye contact with me and kept conversations short and awkward. When I tried to talk to her about something unrelated, a funny moment during the speeches, she cut me off mid-sentence, saying she needed to check on something. The memory of her odd behavior sent a chill down my spine. Could it really have been her? I knew I couldn't jump to conclusions based on a blurry video and a gut feeling, but I also couldn't ignore the fact that the evidence was pointing squarely at her. I decided to dig deeper. The next day, I started asking around. I reached out to a few guests who I thought might have noticed something, starting with my cousin Lisa. Do you remember seeing Sarah near the gift table at any point during the night? I asked her over the phone. Lisa paused for a moment before replying. I don't know. I mean, everyone was walking past it at some point. Why? I try to keep my voice casual. I'm just trying to piece together what happened. That's all. Did you notice anything unusual? Like, did Sarah seem off to you? She hesitated again. Now that you mention it, she was acting kind of weird during the reception. I thought maybe she was stressed or something, but I didn't see her do anything out of the ordinary. It wasn't much, but it was enough to confirm that I wasn't imagining things. Sarah had been acting differently that night. I called a few other people, asking the same questions in different ways. Most of them gave vague answers or said they hadn't noticed anything. It was frustrating, but I couldn't blame them. Weddings are chaotic, and most people are too busy enjoying themselves to pay attention to small details. But one conversation stood out. When I called one of my sister's college friends, Rachel, she let out a surprised laugh when I mentioned Sarah. Oh my God, yes. I totally saw her near the gift table. I thought she was grabbing something for your sister, but now that I think about it, she looked, I don't know, kind of sneaky. My heart raced. Sneaky how? I don't know, Rachel said, sounding unsure. It was just the way she was looking around, like she didn't want anyone to see her. I didn't think much of it at the time, though. Why are you asking? I deflected, saying something vague about helping my sister figure out what happened. But Rachel's comment stuck with me. It wasn't just me who had noticed something odd. Someone else had seen it too. With every new piece of information, my suspicion grew. But as much as I wanted to confront Sarah right then and there, I knew I couldn't. I didn't have enough evidence yet, and if I accused her without something concrete, she'd just deny it and turn it back on me. I decided to keep digging, starting with Sarah's social media. It felt a little invasive, but I was desperate for answers. Her posts from the wedding were all perfectly curated. Smiling selfies with my sister, group photos with the bridal party, and a caption that read, "Such a beautiful day for my best friend's wedding." Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until I checked her tag photos. One of the other bridesmaids had posted a group picture taken near the gift table, and there, in the background, was Sarah. She wasn't looking at the camera. Instead, she was turned slightly to the side, her eyes fixed on something just out of frame. It wasn't damning evidence by any means, but it was another piece of the puzzle. As I pieced everything together, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: anger, betrayal, and even a bit of sadness. If Sarah really had taken the money, then why? What would drive her to do something like that? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I actually knew about her. She'd always been my sister's friend, not mine, and while we'd spent time together over the years, we'd never been close. Maybe there was something going on in her life that I didn't know about. But at the end of the day, none of that mattered. If Sarah had stolen the wedding money, then she needed to face the consequences. For now, I decided to keep my suspicions to myself. I still didn't have enough to confront her outright, and I knew I needed to approach this carefully. But one thing was certain. I was onto something big, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. For days, I wrestled with the decision of whether to confront Sarah. Every fiber of my being wanted to march straight to her and demand answers, but something held me back. What if she denied everything? Worse, what if she twisted the story in a way that made me look even guiltier? My family already believed her over me. Approaching her without solid proof could make things worse. Then there was the matter of my sister. A part of me thought about going to her first, showing her the video, and letting her decide what to do. But deep down, I knew how that would play out. She was too angry, too convinced of my guilt to even entertain the idea that Sarah might be involved. If I went to her without something concrete, she'd probably see it as me trying to deflect blame. So, I decided to go straight to the source. I'd confront Sarah, but I'd do it carefully. I called her, keeping my voice light and casual, like I wasn't even thinking about the missing money. "Hey, Sarah," I said when she picked up. "It's been a while. Want to grab coffee and catch up?" There was a pause on the other end, long enough that I started to wonder if she'd hang up. But then she said, sure. I guess I have some time tomorrow afternoon." Her voice sounded hesitant, almost like she didn't trust my sudden invitation. The next day, we met at a small cafe near her apartment. Sarah showed up late, which didn't surprise me. She'd always been the type to run on her own schedule. When she walked in, she greeted me with a strained smile and sat down across from me, fiddling with the strap of her purse. We started with small talk. I asked her how work was going, and she asked if I'd talked to my sister recently. I kept my answers vague, trying not to give away the real reason I'd asked her to meet. But as the conversation went on, I noticed something. She was nervous. She kept glancing around the cafe, tapping her fingers on the table, and avoiding eye contact. Finally, I decided to test the waters. I leaned back in my chair and said, "The wedding was beautiful. Probably one of the best weddings I've ever been to." Sarah nodded, her smile tightening. "Yeah, it was amazing. Your sister looked stunning. And the reception was great, too," I added. "Though, it's crazy what happened with the gift table." The moment I said it, her entire demeanor changed. Her face went pale, and she froze mid-sip of her coffee. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice a little too high-pitched. I shrugged, pretending to be nonchalant. "Oh, with the missing envelope and all, everyone's still talking about it. Such a weird thing to happen at a wedding, don't you think?" Sarah stammered something about not remembering much from that night, and quickly changed the subject. "So, how's work going for you?" she asked, forcing a smile. I didn't let her off the hook that easily. "It's fine," I said, waving off her question. "But seriously, isn't it wild? I mean, someone must have been pretty bold to take the envelope. You were the maid of honor. You didn't see anything, did you?" Her eyes darted to the side, and she shook her head. "No, I was so busy running around all night. I didn't really notice much." That's when I knew I had her. The way she was fidgeting, the way her voice wavered, it all screamed guilt. But gut feelings weren't enough. I needed undeniable proof, something that even she couldn't deny. I decided to push a little harder. I said, lowering my voice, "I've been looking into it. There's this video I have from the wedding, and it shows someone near the gift table. It's not super clear, but..." I trailed off, watching her reaction. Her hands clenched around her coffee cup, and for a split second, I thought she might bolt out of the cafe. Instead, she forced another smile and said, "Well, I hope you figure it out. I'm sure it's all just a big misunderstanding." After that, the conversation fizzled out. Sarah kept glancing at her watch, clearly looking for an excuse to leave. I didn't stop her when she finally stood up and said, "I should get going. Lots of work to catch up on." As I watched her walk out the door, I felt a mix of emotions. On one hand, I was more certain than ever that she had something to do with the missing money. On the other hand, I hadn't gotten the confession I was hoping for. I spent the rest of the day replaying our conversation in my head, dissecting every word and gesture. While I didn't have concrete proof yet, I knew I was getting closer. Sarah's reaction had confirmed what I already suspected. She was hiding something. But if I wanted to expose her, I'd have to play this carefully. One wrong move, and she'd either deny everything or find a way to pin it back on me. I couldn't afford to let that happen. For now, I decided to keep my next steps to myself. The truth was out there, and I was determined to find it. After the tense meeting with Sarah, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the verge of something big. Her reaction, her pale face, her rushed excuses, it all pointed to one conclusion. But instinct wasn't enough. I needed something solid, something that no one could argue with. That night, I sat down with my phone again and reopened the video I'd found. I'd already watched it a dozen times, but this time, I decided to go even deeper. I slowed the playback to half speed, then quarter speed, carefully analyzing every frame. The figure I was sure was Sarah appeared in the background, her movements deliberate and precise. She crouched slightly, her hand reaching out to the table. It was quick, just a couple of seconds, but when she straightened back up, she wasn't empty-handed. At first, it was hard to tell what she was holding. The angle wasn't great, and the lighting in the room was dim. I tried zooming in, but the image became grainy. Frustrated, I downloaded a free video editing app and adjusted the brightness and contrast, hoping it would help. After about an hour of tweaking, I saw it, a flash of white and gold. It was subtle, but it looked like she was holding an envelope. My heart started pounding. This was it, the evidence I'd been looking for. I rewound the video and watched it again, frame by frame. The envelope wasn't entirely visible, but the shape, the way she slipped it into her clutch, it all lined up. My hands were shaking as I paused the video on the clearest frame I could find. It wasn't perfect, but it was undeniable. Sarah had taken something from the gift table, and I had it on tape. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the screen. Relief, anger, and a strange sense of vindication washed over me all at once. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't the thief. And now, I had proof. But my moment of triumph was short-lived. As much as I wanted to march over to my parents' house and shove the video in their faces, I knew it wasn't that simple. This wasn't a movie where dramatic evidence instantly solved everything. My family was already predisposed to believe Sarah over me. If I didn't present this carefully, they might find a way to dismiss it or twist the narrative even further. I decided to make copies of the video, one on a USB drive, one uploaded to the cloud, and another on my laptop. Paranoia? Maybe. But after everything I'd been through, I wasn't taking any chances. If Sarah thought she could talk her way out of this, she was in for a rude awakening. The next challenge was figuring out how to present the video. A family dinner was coming up in a few days, one of those regular get-togethers my parents insisted on, even during times of tension. Normally, I would have skipped it. The thought of sitting across from my sister, while she glared daggers at me, was enough to make my stomach turn. But now, the dinner felt like the perfect opportunity. I imagined the scene in my head. The family gathered around, the usual passive-aggressive comments flying back and forth. And then me, calmly pulling out the USB and saying, "I think it's time we watch something together." Dramatic? Absolutely. But effective. Still, I couldn't just rely on the video alone. I needed to anticipate their reactions and be ready for the inevitable questions. What if they said the footage was too blurry? What if they accused me of editing it somehow? What if Sarah denied everything and turned the tables on me again? To prepare, I started compiling every piece of supporting evidence I could think of. I printed screenshots of the video's clearest frames and highlighted the envelope in each one. I gathered the testimonies from guests who had noticed Sarah acting suspiciously, including Rachel's comment about her sneaky behavior. I even wrote out a timeline of the night, detailing everything I could remember. By the time I was done, I felt like I was preparing for a court case. But in a way, this wasn't just about clearing my name, it was about reclaiming my place in the family. The day of the dinner arrived, and I could barely focus on anything else. I spent the morning pacing around my apartment, rehearsing what I would say. Should I be calm and matter-of-fact? Or should I let my emotions show, so they'd understand how deeply this had hurt me? When it was finally time to leave, I packed the USB, the screenshots, and my notes into a folder and headed out. My heart was racing the entire drive to my parents' house. As I pulled into the driveway, I took a deep breath and reminded myself why I was doing this. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. I wasn't walking into the lion's den empty-handed. I had the truth on my side, and I was ready to fight for it. Little did I know, the confrontation that awaited me would be even more explosive than I'd imagined. Walking into the family dinner felt like stepping onto a battlefield. The tension in the air was almost tangible, weighing heavy in the room as soon as I entered. Everyone was already seated around the long dining table, a spread of food in front of them, but the atmosphere was anything but warm. Conversations were sparse and forced, mostly my mom and dad making awkward small talk to fill the silence. I took a deep breath and sat down in the seat furthest from my sister. She didn't acknowledge me. Not a glance, not a word. She sat rigid, her eyes glued to her plate like I didn't exist. My mom gave me a tight, uncomfortable smile, and my dad barely glanced in my direction. Even my usually cheerful cousins avoided eye contact, their faces carefully neutral. It was clear that I was still the villain in everyone's story. The first 20 minutes of the dinner dragged on painfully. Forks clinked against plates, and the occasional comment about the weather or work broke the silence. But nobody addressed the elephant in the room, me. It felt like they were all just waiting for me to say something, to make a scene, so they could confirm their belief that I was the troublemaker. I stayed quiet, though my stomach churned with anxiety. My heart was racing, and the folder in my bag felt heavier with each passing second. I could barely touch the food in front of me. All I could think about was the USB drive and the video it held. Finally, I decided it was time. Halfway through the meal, when the conversations had lulled to an awkward silence, I cleared my throat. "I have something I need to show everyone," I said, my voice steady despite the knot in my chest. The table froze. My dad sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair like he already regretted what I was about to say. "What is it now?" he asked, his tone laced with exhaustion. "It's important," I said firmly. "And it's about the wedding money." That got their attention. My sister's head snapped up, and for the first time all evening, she looked directly at me. Her expression was a mix of anger and disbelief. "A what? Are you going to accuse someone else now?" she snapped. I didn't rise to the bait. "I'm not accusing anyone," I said. "I just want to show you something. It's a video I found from the wedding." My dad pinched the bridge of his nose, muttering, "Can we not do this right now?" But I wasn't backing down. "I think you'll want to see this," I said, pulling the USB drive from my bag. "Can we connect this to the TV?" There was a long, tense pause as everyone exchanged glances. My mom finally stood up and walked to the living room, wordlessly turning on the TV and gesturing for me to come over. I followed her, my hands shaking as I inserted the USB and navigated to the video file. The room was dead silent as the video started playing. At first, it was just a cheerful clip of the speeches, the bride and groom smiling as they thanked everyone for being there. But then the camera panned slightly, and the gift table came into view. As the blurry figure moved into the frame, I glanced around the room. My sister was staring at the screen, her brow furrowed. My dad leaned forward, squinting like he wasn't sure what he was seeing. And then, as Sarah's face became visible, my mom let out a quiet gasp. The video clearly showed Sarah near the gift table. She crouched down, her hand reaching towards something, and when she stood back up, she was holding an envelope. It was quick, subtle, and easy to miss, but it was there. When the video ended, the room was completely still. Nobody said a word. My sister was the first to break the silence. What is this supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice shaking. "It means exactly what it looks like," I said, my tone measured. Sarah was near the gift table. She took something, and I think we all know what that something was. Sarah, who had been sitting quietly up until now, finally spoke. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice defensive. "I don't even remember doing that. I was probably moving something for the bride or organizing the table. This doesn't prove anything." "It proves you were there," I shot back. "And it proves that you took an envelope. You can't deny it. It's right there on video." The tension in the room skyrocketed. My sister looked back and forth between me and Sarah, her face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "Sarah, is this true?" she asked quietly. Sarah hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "Of course not," she said, her voice rising. "I don't even know what this video is supposed to show. It's blurry, and anyone could have been near that table. I didn't take anything." Before anyone could respond, I pulled out the folder with the screenshots I'd printed. "Here," I said, handing them to my dad. "These are frames from the video. You can see the envelope in her hand. It's clear as day." My dad flipped through the pages, his face grim. My mom looked over his shoulder, her hand covering her mouth. "This can't be right," my sister muttered, her voice cracking. "Sarah, you wouldn't do this, would you?" Sarah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I don't have to sit here and listen to this nonsense, she said, grabbing her bag. I didn't steal anything, and I'm not going to be blamed for something I didn't do. Then explain the video, I said, my voice rising. Explain why you were at the gift table, why you took an envelope, and why you've been acting so guilty ever since. Sarah didn't respond. She stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. My family sat in stunned silence, their eyes fixed on the door. For the first time since the accusations began, I felt like I wasn't the one under the microscope. But even as I felt a small surge of relief, I knew the fallout from this was far from over. The room was still charged with tension after Sarah stormed out, but it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. My sister sat frozen, her face pale as she stared at the now-blank TV screen. Everyone else exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the revelation settling over the room like a suffocating cloud. Finally, my sister broke the silence. I don't understand, she said, her voice shaking. She turned to my parents, then back to the door Sarah had slammed shut. Why would she do this? No one answered. My dad looked like he was still trying to process what he'd seen. My mom wiped at her eyes, but she wasn't crying yet, just stunned. I sat quietly, watching the cracks in their confidence widen. For once, I didn't feel like the outsider. After a minute or two, my sister stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I need to talk to her, she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. She grabbed her phone and started toward the door, but my dad stopped her. Wait, he said firmly, holding up a hand. Let's think this through before we go charging after her. If this video is real, and it looks like it is, then we need answers. But we're not going to get them if we let our emotions take over. My sister hesitated, her phone still in her hand. Dad, she's my best friend. She wouldn't. Her voice faltered. She couldn't do something like this. Right? I didn't say anything, but the words hung in the air. She did. The front door suddenly opened, and everyone turned to look. Sarah stepped back inside, her expression defiant, but with an edge of fear behind her eyes. I'm not running away, she said, her voice trembling slightly. But this is ridiculous. You're all going to believe a blurry video over me? Over everything we've been through. My sister took a step toward her, clutching her phone tightly. Sarah, she said, her voice quivering. Tell me the truth. Did you take the money? Sarah's gaze flicked to me, then back to my sister. No, she said quickly. I didn't take anything. That video doesn't prove anything. It's just a mistake. My dad crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. Then explain why you were near the gift table, he said. Explain what you were holding in your hand. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her face flushed, and she looked down at her feet. I don't remember, she finally stammered. It was a busy night. I might have been moving something for the bride, like I said. You don't remember? My mom repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. That's not an answer, Sarah. The pressure in the room mounted, and Sarah's facade started to crack. Fine, she snapped suddenly, throwing her hands in the air. Yes, I took the envelope, but it wasn't what you think. A collective gasp rippled through the room. My sister took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth. What do you mean you took it? She asked, her voice breaking. Sarah looked around the room, her eyes darting from face to face. I didn't steal it. I was going to, I don't know, keep it safe. Or count it, maybe, to make sure no one else did something shady. Sarah, I said, finally speaking up, that doesn't even make sense. If you were keeping it safe, why didn't you give it to someone? Why didn't you tell my sister? Why hide it in your clutch? Her face turned an even deeper shade of red. I was going to return it, she insisted. I just forgot. My sister's expression crumpled, and she sank back into her chair. You forgot, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. You forgot to give back the money from my wedding? The money people gave us to start our life together. The room erupted into chaos. My dad started yelling at Sarah, demanding to know what she'd been thinking. My mom joined in, her voice shrill with anger and disappointment. My sister, meanwhile, burst into tears, burying her face in her hands as her shoulders shook. Even my cousins, who had stayed silent until now, started chiming in with their own accusations and outrage. Sarah tried to defend herself, her voice rising above the noise, but her excuses only made things worse. I didn't mean for this to happen, she shouted. I panicked, okay? I thought I could handle it, but it just got out of control. Out of control, my dad roared. You blame my daughter. You let this whole family turn against her because you couldn't own up to what you did. For the first time since the accusations began, I felt something other than anger and frustration. I felt relief. The truth was out, and everyone in the room finally saw Sarah for who she was. But as much as I wanted to bask in that relief, the reality of the situation was hard to ignore. My family had believed her over me without hesitation. They turned their backs on me without a second thought. The yelling continued, but I tuned most of it out, lost in my own thoughts. When Sarah finally stormed out for good, slamming the door behind her, the room fell into a heavy silence once again. My sister wiped at her eyes, her makeup smeared, and looked at me. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice cracking. "I should have believed you." The apology was long overdue, but it didn't feel as satisfying as I'd imagined. The damage had already been done, and I wasn't sure how long it would take to repair the rift between us, or if it ever fully could be repaired. As I sat there, surrounded by my chastened family, I realized that the fallout from this wasn't just about the stolen money or Sarah's betrayal. It was about trust that had been broken, not just by Sarah, but by everyone in that room. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of closure. But I also knew this was just the beginning of a much longer journey to rebuild what had been lost. After the storm of accusations, denials, and the final dramatic exit of Sarah, the house was eerily quiet. The tension that had filled the air during dinner had lifted, but it left a heavy weight behind. Everyone was still seated around the table, their faces a mixture of shock, regret, and exhaustion. My parents were the first to break the silence. My mom reached across the table and placed her hand on mine, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "We owe you an apology," she said softly. Her voice wavered, and for a moment, it felt like she might break down completely. "We should have believed you from the beginning." My dad nodded, his usual stoic expression softened by guilt. "I don't know what to say, other than, I'm sorry. We were wrong. We let our emotions get the best of us, and we didn't give you a fair chance." I wanted to feel relief at hearing those words, but all I felt was a hollow ache. The apologies came too late. For weeks, I'd been treated like a criminal, like a pariah, by the very people who were supposed to have my back. My sister, who had been staring down at her hands, finally spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry too," she said, not looking at me. I should have listened. I should have trusted you." I stared at her, searching her face for some sign of sincerity. But all I saw was guilt, a heavy, suffocating guilt that seemed to weigh her down. She wasn't apologizing because she truly believed in my innocence. She was apologizing because she'd been proven wrong. "Why didn't you trust me?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. "I'm your sister. How could you believe Sarah over me?" Her head snapped up, and she looked at me with tear-filled eyes. "I don't know," she said, her voice breaking. Sarah was my best friend. She's been there for me through everything, and I thought I could trust her. And when she said it was you," her voice trailed off, and I felt a surge of anger. "So what? That was enough for you?" I snapped. "You've known me your entire life. Does that mean nothing to you?" My mom quickly jumped in, trying to defuse the situation. "We all made mistakes," she said gently. "But what matters now is that we know the truth. And we're so sorry for the way we treated you." I wanted to scream that sorry wasn't enough, that no apology could erase the pain of being abandoned and vilified by the people I loved most. But I also knew there was no point in yelling. Nothing could change the past. "I appreciate the apology," I said finally, my voice tight. "But this isn't something I can just forget about. It's not just about the money. It's about trust. You all turned on me so fast, without even giving me a chance to explain. That hurts more than anything Sarah did." My dad nodded solemnly. "You're right," he said, "and we'll do whatever it takes to make this right." The conversation shifted after that, becoming more about logistics than emotions. My parents promised to help my sister retrieve the stolen money from Sarah, though nobody seemed eager to confront her again. My mom suggested getting a lawyer involved if Sarah refused to cooperate, but my sister looked horrified at the idea. "She's still my friend," she said weakly, though it was clear even she didn't believe her own words. I stayed quiet during most of the discussion, feeling like an outsider even as they tried to include me. It was clear they were trying to make amends, but I couldn't shake the bitterness that lingered in the back of my mind. When the meeting finally ended, my mom pulled me into a tight hug. "I know this won't fix everything," she said, her voice muffled against my shoulder. "But we'll do better. I promise." I hugged her back, but my heart wasn't in it. Forgiveness would take time, and I wasn't sure if things would ever truly go back to the way they were. As I drove home that night, I replayed the evening in my head. The apologies, the promises, the tears, it all felt so hollow. They were sorry now, sure, but where had that loyalty been when I needed it most? I knew I'd try to move on, if only for my own sanity. But one thing was clear. This wasn't something I'd brush off. The cracks in our relationships might heal over time, but they'd always leave scars. For now, I was content to take things one day at a time. I'd gotten the truth, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. But the road to rebuilding trust would be long, and I wasn't sure any of us were ready for that journey just yet. In the weeks following the dinner, life settled into a strange new normal. The storm had passed, but the damage it left behind was impossible to ignore. I wasn't getting bombarded with accusations anymore, and my family wasn't giving me the cold shoulder, but things were far from the way they used to be. My relationship with my sister, in particular, felt irreparably altered. We spoke occasionally, mostly through text, and even those conversations were short and surface level. She'd apologized several times since the dinner, but her words felt like she was saying what she thought I wanted to hear, rather than truly owning the depth of her betrayal. I wanted to forgive her. I really did, but I couldn't shake the memory of how quickly she'd believed the worst about me. For years, we'd had our ups and downs like any siblings do. But this was different. It wasn't just about her accusing me. It was about how little trust she'd shown in me when it mattered most. I found myself pulling away from the rest of the family as well. Not intentionally at first, but it just became harder to be around them. Every time we were in the same room, I felt like I was back at that dinner table, surrounded by judgment and doubt. It wasn't that they weren't trying to make things better. My mom texted me more often, checking in and trying to plan lunches or coffee dates. My dad invited me over to watch football, like we used to do before everything fell apart. Even my cousins reached out, sending me funny memes and videos as if nothing had ever happened. But despite their efforts, there was a lingering tension I couldn't ignore. Maybe it was because I was still processing everything, or maybe it was because I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Either way, the thought of being vulnerable with them again felt impossible. As for Sarah, she was out of the picture entirely. My sister, after a lot of deliberation and tears, finally cut her off. "I can't believe I trusted her," she said during one of our rare conversations. "I feel so stupid." Part of me wanted to console her, to tell her it wasn't her fault, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I said, "You're not stupid. You're just too trusting sometimes." It wasn't meant as a jab, but it came out harsher than I intended. My sister didn't respond, and the conversation ended soon after. From what I heard through the family grapevine, Sarah had tried reaching out to a few people, including my sister, to explain herself. Nobody gave her the time of day. She'd burned too many bridges that night, and the family wasn't interested in hearing her excuses. Part of me felt a grim sense of satisfaction at seeing her get what she deserved. But another part of me, the part that always tried to see the best in people, wondered what had driven her to do something so cruel. Did she really need the money that badly? Was it jealousy or something else entirely? I'd probably never know, and maybe that was for the best. Looking back, the entire ordeal still felt surreal. For weeks, I'd been at the center of a storm I didn't create, fighting to prove my innocence against people who were supposed to know me best. It was one of the hardest things I'd ever been through, and it left scars I wasn't sure would ever fully heal. But it also taught me something important. When people doubt you, the truth has a way of coming out, if you're willing to fight for it. It wasn't easy, and there were times when I wanted to give up, but I'm glad I didn't. Life isn't the same now, and maybe it never will be. I still see my family, but not as often as I used to. The distance feels necessary for my own peace of mind, if nothing else. My sister and I are working on rebuilding our relationship, but it's a slow process. Trust takes years to build and seconds to destroy, and we're both still figuring out how to move forward. Despite everything, I found a strange sense of peace. I've learned to set boundaries, to trust my instincts, and to stand up for myself even when it feels like the world is against me. I don't know what the future holds for my relationships with my family, but I do know one thing. I'm stronger now than I was before. And no matter what happens, I'll carry that strength with me for the rest of my life. If nothing else, this experience reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten. The truth is powerful. Even when it feels like no one's on your side, the truth has a way of shining through the darkest moments. You just have to hold on long enough to see it.